Hello, I'm Laura Walker. I'm president of Bennington College, and thank you all so much for joining us here tonight. We are actually in the Brick House, which is the president's house at Bennington. And I am so delighted to welcome David Sanger, New York Times writer and good friend, to discuss his best-selling book, The Perfect Weapon, and the HBO documentary that it inspired, which is really an incredible documentary. And I think you'll all have a link to it. So I encourage you to watch, and you'll want to watch even more after tonight's event. And I want to thank WAMC's Joe Donahue for joining us to lead this timely discussion. And we are also delighted that this will be, it's being recorded and it will be aired on Friday on WAMC. And as you know, WAMC has stations all over this area in Vermont and New York, 23 stations. In fact, if you listen to WAMC or any of its sister or brother stations, you know that because they identify each one of those stations in their station breaks. And so you understand how big it is. And Joe Donahue is the vice president of news and programming there. And he's the host and editorial director of Roundtable, which is an award-winning daily radio program, and which our own Judith Enck appears on every Friday. And so tune in to hear her. Joe's guests have included the past US presidents, the Dalai Lama, Maya Angelou, Betty White, to name a few. We are so lucky to have him here. We will also be joined afterwards by Mary Brooks, who's an associate producer and a researcher on the documentary film. She met David when he was her professor at the Kennedy School up at Harvard. And and we'll talk about later a little bit about that class and about what it was like to research and work on both the book and on the documentary. But now I am so pleased to kind of introduce and welcome David Sanger, who lives in DC most of the time, but also has a house here in Vermont. So we are very pleased to have him and his wife, Cheryl, here with us. And he is the national security correspondent and a senior writer at the New York Times. But I first met David 34 years ago, I think it was, when his wife and my soon-to-be husband were in law school together. He had only been at the New York Times about 4 years at that point. I think David's been there for 38 years. And I think one of the times I met him soon after, sometime at the end of our law school, business school careers, I was told David just won a Pulitzer Prize. And he had won a Pulitzer then for his work as a team reporting about the Challenger. And he has won I think only two other, but several other Pulitzer Prizes, most recently in 2017 for international reporting. He's the author of 2 Times bestsellers on foreign policy and national security. David has served so the two bestsellers are, because you'll want to read these: The Inheritance, The World Obama Confronts and the Challenges to American Power, and Confront and Conceal, Obama's Secret Wars and Surprising Use of American Power. David has served as the New York Times Tokyo bureau chief, Washington economic correspondent, White House correspondent during the Clinton and Bush administrations. So Joe is here to interview him, and I will leave it to Joe to introduce, to take it from here. And thank you again, both David Sanger and Joe Donahue, for joining us in the Bennington community. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Laura Walker and to everyone at Bennington College for making this possible. A beautiful evening. This is my first event out of the house, so this feels just great. It's nice not to be doing a Zoom event in the living room. It's nice to be out and actually seeing my guests. This is wonderful. I would quick note before we officially get started, and that is Laura Walker sat down with my boss, Dr. Alan Chartock, and they had a lovely discussion, and that will air tomorrow at 1 p.m. on WAMC. It'll also be available online at WAMC.org. So make sure you tune into that. It was a beautiful discussion. The two of them had 2 old friends, so very good time there. Great pleasure. Thank you very much for doing this with us. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Joe. It's great to be back with you. We've done this once or twice before in previous times, and really great to be here at Bennington, to be at the Brick House, and for me and Cheryl to be back with our wonderful friends, Laura and Bert. It's a long friendship, as Laura indicated, and I think somehow they may get accustomed to living here in the brick house. I don't know why I think it won't be that hard.
How long did it take you to get accustomed to living in Vermont?
Not long, not hard to do that at all. We've had a place in Vermont for 28 years now. And when we finally got too cooped up in Washington in late spring, we basically moved up here. We periodically bounced back to Washington. I'm going to go back for the election in a few days. But this is the first time we've sort of settled in and basically tried to live as flatlanders in Vermont, and the natives have been very welcoming. I would say they haven't reminded us of the fact that we're from Washington all that often.
All that often. So The Perfect Weapon is now an incredible documentary on HBO. It is out and available. You can see it when they show it, or obviously you can stream it whenever you wish. The book came out in 2018. This is released just before the election. At what point did you know that a documentary would come out of the book?
Well, soon after the book came out, the then president of HBO called and told me they had a really hard time over the years just trying to figure out how you do a documentary about cyber, because you don't want to have a documentary in which, as our director, great director John Maggio put it, you had a bunch of guys in hoodies leaning over keyboards. And you will not see anybody in a hoodie leaning over keyboards even once in this documentary. So the question was not could we do it, but could we find a way to do it as sort of a thriller, kind of a truly engaging documentary, not a bunch of talking heads sitting around saying, this is a very severe problem.
Mm.
And I think that what's happened now over time is that as we worked away on it, we found ways to begin to do that. But the hard part was figuring out how to make the whole thing work.
The way you do it is fascinating. It is, you do it chronologically. You begin in 2007. Why was that a good year and a good place to start?
It wasn't as much of the year as the event.
Right.
We begin with what the world came to know as Stuxnet, which was the American cyber attack, American and Israeli cyber attack on Iran's nuclear program. And it was one of the most secret operations the United States has ever run. It was codenamed Olympic Games. And for 3 years, the United States and Israel got code that into the computers that controlled this underground nuclear enrichment site, where these giant centrifuges spin at supersonic speeds to produce uranium. And that's, of course, one of the basic fuels for nuclear weapons. No uranium, no bomb. And the reason that they did it was that President Bush had just been through the experience of the invasion of Iraq on the false pretense that they were building a nuclear weapon.
Mm-hmm.
He said to me on numerous occasions he could never convince anybody that in public that Iran was building a nuclear weapon, even though there wasn't a whole lot of dispute in the country that the Iranians at least had that as an ambition. And so one day a group of generals and intelligence officials came to him and said, sir, we've got another way. And it was trying to use a cyber weapon. Nobody really thought this would work. And so they set up secretly underground in Tennessee, a model of the Natanz nuclear enrichment site, and then attacked it with code. And the question was, could they make the centrifuges blow up? And they did. And that began the whole process. But in 2010, the code got out of Natanz by mistake, and it began spreading around the world. And when it spread around the world, we began looking at the structure of the code And that led me to some of the reporting that was in Confront and Conceal, a book that Laura just referred to, about how the US, through two presidents, put this together in the Situation Room, with those presidents basically picking out the locations that would be attacked.
Mhm.
That opened the age of cyber conflict.
One of the things that you talk about in the book, and also, of course, in the documentary, is that code initially was fascinating because it would go in and then would just kind of lie in wait,
Right.
and then would attack.
You know, it did more than that, Joe. It did lie in wait. It watched how normal operations happened. And then, like a scene in Ocean's 11, where you may remember that they go into the safe in the casino, but they run a tape back to the control room that shows the normal operation of,
Everything is okay here.
nothing's happening,
Right.
while it's being cleaned out. That's essentially what the code did. It sent signals back to the control room that said everything's spinning fine, until the Iranians started hearing centrifuges exploding underground.
So the two things that the US basically had at this time were the drone program and Olympic Games. Then in 2010, then what happens as far as how the US says, okay, did they know what they had really?
Well, the US knew exactly what they had, and they knew and met in the Situation Room in the summer of 2010 as the code began to leak out. And they recognized that suddenly the Iranians were going to realize that these centrifuges weren't blowing up because of mistakes they were making or because of scientists that were making mistakes or manufacturing error. It was blowing up because malicious code was being put into it. And in the current context, it's pretty interesting because when you go and reconstruct those meetings, Joe Biden is sitting right there in the midst of it and saying to President Obama, I think the Israelis made a mistake here. They were rushing to get some new code in, and it got out, which appears to be the leading theory about what went wrong. For us, journalistically, it was an interesting moment because a piece of code carries signatures with it just the way a fingerprint or DNA would. You can pick it apart and see where the people who wrote it were trained. They're sort of leaving a signature behind. This code was designed only to attack groups of 164 machines, which I knew from covering the Iranian nuclear program for many years is exactly the way the Iranians organized the centrifuges in their centrifuge halls, in groups of 164. So when we saw that number, we knew right away what this code was intended for.
When you look, there's a quote in the documentary where it is said, they're legitimized attacks without declaring war. And so you also make the point that from, say, 2007, this isn't on the radar at all as a threat. And then by 2012, cyber is the number one threat that is considered, basically.
That's right. If you go back to the 2007 intelligence agency's annual report to Congress about threats to the United States, and you go to read the cyber section, it doesn't take a lot of your day. There is no cyber section. In the past 7 or 8 years, it's been the number one threat. And tonight, as we sit here, we have hospitals across America that are being attacked by ransomware in the midst of the COVID treatment crisis. And we actually only became aware of a lot of these attacks today. Now, we don't know how severe they're going to be, whether or not they'll paralyze these hospitals. But that's something we've now learned to live with each and every day. Cyber conflict has escalated. But as you point out, Joe, these are not necessarily acts of war. What's remarkable about the day-to-day cyber conflict is that it's all carefully calibrated, or has been so far, to stay just below that threshold that would require you to have a military response. And part of what we do in the documentary is take you through this escalating series of attacks on the Sony Pictures Entertainment case, on the Sands Casino, against OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, and how each one of the aggressors, North Korea, Iran, China, made sure that while they were escalating, they didn't go over that invisible red line that might trigger a military response. And really, that's part of the problem right now, which is that most countries believe this is a free fire zone. You can do this without really significant consequence. So some of your operators might be exposed or indicted. You might get some financial sanctions, but basically it's worth it to take the risk.
The Sands was really the first, right? That began, and was that because Sheldon Adelson was shooting his mouth off, basically?
So the Sands Casino in Las Vegas is, known to anybody who's seen pictures of the Strip or visited there. It's owned by Sheldon Adelson, who was a major conservative donor and a major supporter of Israel. And one day he had been at Yeshiva University in New York and was being interviewed about what he thought the United States should do about Iran's nuclear program. And he said, well, we should just call in the jets. You'll see the video of this in the documentary. It's a rather remarkable moment. And drop a nuclear weapon in the Iranian desert and tell them that the next one will be in Tehran if they don't turn over their nuclear program. So the Iranians, it turns out, caught this on YouTube. Yeah, you can get YouTube in Iran. And they're thinking, Sheldon Adelson, desert, guy owns a casino.
Right.
Be really a shame if his operators came in one day and flipped on the switches and nothing happened, which is exactly what happened 3 months later. And the casino, while there were rumors of this out there, went to extraordinary lengths to hide what had happened because it was so embarrassing. And when we went to film this years later, we had to go find employees of the Sands who had been forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. And you'll see them in the documentary with their faces obscured and their voices changed, describing what it was like to be there during the attack.
Of course, there's the Sands in Las Vegas, but they initially hit the Sands in, is it Nebraska?
I think they hit one on the East Coast early on. They hit a related facility and used it to tunnel through to get to this. What they really wanted to do was be in Vegas.
Right.
Yeah.
And as you point out in the documentary, in this case, what happens in Vegas didn't stay in Vegas. It did not stay.
One of those many. Too often it happens that way. What happens in Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. But yeah, this one certainly didn't. And today the idea of attacking Sony, which melted down 70% of their computing power, or a casino, almost seems like single A ball compared to the scope of some of the cyber operations we've seen since.
There was the attack on Sony, and this comes after, I guess, the start of this was the movie The Interview. Seth Rogen is featured in the documentary. So North Korea gets upset over the film. And as far as Sony goes, they are looking for, yes, they knew what to release, right? As far as there was the Hollywood gossip and then also threats that came with that.
So the Sony story is really a remarkable one because it's one of the first times when geopolitics led to a cyber attack in the United States. It was a bizarre example because it was, as you say, over a Seth Rogen movie. One that I don't think was one of his better movies,
no.
But we'll set that aside for the moment. And in the documentary, you'll see Seth Rogen describing what this is like. There are very few documentaries I can think of out there that have both Seth Rogen and Hillary Clinton both describing what it was like to be a victim of a cyber attack.
And John Podesta.
And John Podesta, that's right. And I keep telling people I'm in a Seth Rogen movie, and they look at me like, yeah, sure. So the interview was a crazy comedy about two journalists who get sent off to interview Kim Jong-un, who was supposed to like their TV show or something. And the CIA hires them to assassinate Kim Jong-un on the way out. And we're thinking of this in, American terms. Oh, gee, isn't that, a funny, crazy Seth Rogen plot? North Koreans look at it and it's a deep offense. So they write to Sony and they say, you can't bring this out. And Sony ignores them. And they write to the UN Secretary General and say, you must stop this. He ignores them. And then they send a couple of hackers to China, Thailand, Malaysia. They spent months working out code to break into Sony. And when they get in there, they figure out where everything is, the emails, the production schedules, the films that are getting ready to be released. They released a few of the emails in sort of an early indication of what the Russians would do later on. This is how we learned the important national security information that some people at the studio thought that Angelina Jolie was extremely difficult to work with on the set. We didn't do much with these emails of the New York Times, but the National Enquirer had a great time with them. Along the way, the hackers then figured out that the real way to wreak revenge on Sony was to melt down their computers. And right around Thanksgiving of 2014, that's exactly what they did.
You make the point in the documentary that that event changed the perception of cyber attacks purely as an attack to destroy.
That's right. It, like Stuxnet, it was out there to do physical harm in the physical world. And this led to a fascinating debate in the Obama White House. There were some military officials who came in and said, Mr. President, this is an act of war. If they had blown up Sony's facilities, we'd be at war with them right now. Obama looked at them and said, act of war? This is a Seth Rogen movie. Turns out, by the way, Obama likes Seth Rogen movies, but who knew? And so he said this is an act of sabotage. I think publicly he said it was an act of vandalism. I think he later came to regret, I know he later came to regret the use of that phrase as sort of taking it too lightly. But the US really didn't know how to respond. In the end, they put some sanctions on North Korea. I mean, I don't think the North Koreans noticed amid all the other sanctions on North Korea. They convinced the Chinese to turn off the internet connection to North Korea for a couple of days around New Year's in 2015. I think the North Koreans probably thought they'd forgotten to pay their cable bill. It didn't really make a big difference to North Korea. And that was the beginning of a series of mistakes I think the Obama administration made in underreacting to cyber attacks that ultimately set a signal to Vladimir Putin that he was free to go ahead into the DNC and other attacks because there really is no penalty here.
President Obama quoted, you have the tape in the documentary, where he says, we will respond proportionally.
I don't think we did.
Right.
I don't think we did. I think we did some temporary pinprick operations. And it's interesting because later on we take you to the testimony of Paul Nakasone, the general who now runs US Cyber Command. And at his confirmation hearing, he said quite clearly in response to a question from one senator that our enemies don't fear us on this. And they don't fear us because the North Koreans got away with what they got away with, and Iran got away with what they got away with, and the Chinese got away with what they got away with. So the fundamental deterrence calculation just wasn't working.
David Sanger is our guest. The name of the book and the documentary, The Perfect Weapon. So you mentioned Russia. So Russia at this point is lurking, right? They're watching this and they're lurking. And why the DNC?
Because it was unguarded, very easy to get into. In fact, not one, but two different Russian intelligence agencies broke into the DNC. And as far as we can tell, each one didn't know the other one was there, which tells you they kind of operate the way we do. But they figured that somewhere in that trove of emails would be enough embarrassing data to just send the Hillary Clinton campaign into chaos. And we have to remember that Vladimir Putin had a particular problem with Hillary Clinton. And that was that when the 2012 elections were underway in Russia, she charged that the elections were fixed. And that led to some street protests in Moscow that most Americans don't remember, but Vladimir Putin remembers them. And he was determined when she was running for president that he was going to remind her in a very vivid way of the way she sort of held American democracy over to embarrass the Russians. And part of his goal here is not necessarily to elect Donald Trump or unelect Joe Biden or anything like that. It's to make us question the value of our own democracy. And he did a pretty good job of it, because when you think of it, the attacks in 2016 resulted in 4 years of investigation. And here we are, days from an American presidential election, and we're still wondering what it is that the Russians may do in this election cycle.
Which, of course, I want to get to. What's fascinating, and I'd even forgotten this, was how close when WikiLeaks, when that drop comes, that's as the Democratic National Convention is beginning.
That's right. In the opening days of the convention, just hours before it started, they released a series of emails that made it clear that the DNC did, in fact, favor Hillary Clinton and send all the resources to her over Bernie Sanders, Vermont senator. And it basically proved what Sanders folks had been saying for some time. And ultimately, the chairwoman of the Democratic Party had to resign hours before the convention opened, throwing the convention into considerable chaos. But they weren't done at that moment.
They were not done. And as the White House, the Obama White House, becomes aware of this, I mean, the real conundrum is that if you do this, if you say it too loudly, are you trying to tip the race?
Well, they had two problems. One is, if you call out the Russians for doing this, are you amplifying their message that you can't control this? So there was some movement and some caution on part of President Obama and some of his advisors. Don't talk about it much because you'll be serving their purposes. And then the second concern seems kind of quaint under current circumstances, that Obama was saying, I don't want to look to be putting my finger on the scale here. I mean, obviously he favored Hillary Clinton, but he didn't want to be going out giving speeches about the Russians supporting Trump that would seem to be spilling stuff. I'm not sure that President Trump would have a similar compunction, but in any case, they didn't. And I think partly this was because they were convinced that Secretary Clinton was going to win and that they could deal with the Russians later.
So the intelligence community says, okay, we have concerns and we have to notify the public that this is happening.
Right.
So they go out and say, we're ready, here we go. And at almost the exact moment, the Access Hollywood tape drops.
Right.
And guess what? Nobody cares about Russia anymore.
A bunch of things happened. So this was at about 3:30 in the afternoon on October 7th, 2016. It's seared in my memory. I was sitting in the New York Times newsroom in Washington, and we had a little bit of warning that the Director of National Intelligence was going to announce that, in fact, they had concluded Russia was responsible and that Putin probably knew about it. We had already reported a few months before that had been the intelligence conclusion, but here they were coming out and publicly announcing it. A half hour later, the Access Hollywood tape. And a half hour after that, WikiLeaks begins to dump out the John Podesta emails, all within the space of an hour. Now, that's a news day.
It is a news day. And obviously, a lot of that gets eclipsed, but both in the documentary and in the book, you talk about your conversation with Donald Trump about cyber warfare and cyber attacks. That was as far as we got on how the nominee thought about the newest weapon that Russia and the United States were utilizing in a global struggle for power. Quote, cyber is the future, his quote. But worse yet, he fueled our suspicion that at a minimum, he was perfectly comfortable with what was clearly Russian interference in the election. And he made us wonder whether wittingly or unwittingly, he had become Putin's agent of influence. It is the wittingly or unwittingly I want to ask you about now that we have 4 years under our belt.
Well, that turned out to be the beginning of a series of denials by the president, then the candidate, that Putin had been responsible for the attacks that we just described. It's an interesting argument to make because President Trump's own Justice Department has indicted 12 Russian officers of the GRU and members of the Internet Research Agency for this operation. And they've laid out in an indictment in great detail how they did it. And yet you hear the president come back and say, Russia, 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 it's the Russia hoax and so forth. Sort of makes you wonder, well, if he believes this was all fabricated, shouldn't his Justice Department drop the charges against these poor falsely accused Russian officers? They haven't done so yet. So there's this large divide even within the Trump administration between intelligence and justice officials, FBI officials, who have no doubt what the Russians did, and the president's imperative not to acknowledge this, because I think he believes, his own aides have said to me, that he believes that it impugns whether or not his election was legitimate. Now, I happen to believe he would have been elected had the Russians interfered or not. There's no way to prove the Russian interference resulted in his election, but it's very heartfelt for him. Now, what's interesting is next week, if it's a close election, will he feel compelled to say that there was interference, not in 2016, but in 2020?
So 2017 is the first time that he goes face to face with Putin, and they have the meeting in Hamburg. So they go behind closed doors. The president calls you as he's headed going toward Air Force One. Shortly after the summit broke up, you wrote, Trump headed for Air Force One and called me once he was in the air. He wanted to describe his first encounter with Putin. Most of Trump's call was off the record, but some of what he told me that afternoon, he repeated at various times in the next few days in talking about the session. He had raised the election hacking 3 times, he said, and Putin had denied involvement each time. But what was more remarkable, you write, was the explanation he gave. Trump had asked if he was involved in election meddling. He said, Putin denied it and said, if we did, we wouldn't have gotten caught because we're professionals. And he believed it.
More importantly, the president said to me, David, you write about this stuff. Don't you believe that? They wouldn't have been caught, right? And I said to him, Mr. President, you've seen all the intelligence reports here. And he said, yeah, but they all came from Clapper and Comey and Brennan, all of the Obama era intelligence officials. He said, they're all political people. I can't believe any of that. It was a pretty remarkable moment. He was basically saying, I'm going to believe Vladimir Putin over the American intelligence establishment. So as you just alluded to, the question that will come next week, if the president does indeed lose, is what is the level of Russian interference? But we're going to talk about that regardless, right? I mean, you mentioned the hospitals of what is happening as we record this interview. So this is happening. One of the things I just want to back up before we talk about that, and I thought it was really interesting because you touch on it toward the end of the documentary, which is the Iowa Caucuses.
So just because there was a meltdown, was that interference or not? Part of this game is that you can assume that because there's chaos.
So in the Iowa caucuses, you may remember people put together, well-intentioned people, a new app so that you
Right.
could caucus even if there were snowstorms keeping people away. And the thing hadn't been tested out well. It was like getting a bad app on your phone, right? And
We've all had
it basically fell apart during the first use in Iowa. And you'll see this in the film. But the Russians had nothing to do with it. You know, this was just a plain old mistake. But of course, as soon as it went bad, everyone's first thought was, this must be the Russians. And just the fact that we had that perception tells you how deeply ingrained this is. And you know, Joe, it happened again last week in Virginia. It was the last day to register to vote.
Right.
And people were trying to register online. And someone with a backhoe mistakenly went through the telecommunications line that links the Virginia Secretary of State registration office to the rest of the world. And for 4 hours, you couldn't get online. And everybody's initial thought was, someone's messing with this. Well, no one was messing with this.
It's what you call in the documentary a perception attack.
That's right.
Our mind asks if it's the Russians, and it doesn't matter whether it is or not because we're asking the question.
That's right. And we lose confidence in our system.
Okay, so that was 300 years ago in February of this year. And then in March comes the global pandemic, which again gives an opportunity for things to be impacted by cyber.
Boy, a bunch of new opportunities. First of all, the Chinese target turns away from, collecting the secrets of building stealth aircraft to the secrets of putting a vaccine together. We're all working from home, creating a range of new vulnerabilities. I've got neighbors in Washington who work for the intelligence agencies. Well, they can't work from home easily because they don't have classified systems coming into their houses. And while some are going into work, you know what happens. More and more people find outside channels to get work done that they normally would do over classified systems.
Right.
More and more businesses are operating over systems they never thought about securing, whether they're newspapers or law firms or manufacturers or whatever. So it accelerated what's been happening in the cyber world anyway, which is an increase in the attack surface. And just imagine what was in your own home 10 years ago. Maybe you had a desktop computer connected to the internet. Now your TVs are connected to the internet, your refrigerator's connected,
Right.
your Fitbit's connected, the car outside's connected, and every one of those is a convenience. And every one of those opens up the attack surface.
2 points that I want to talk about before we try to figure out what's going to happen next week. But so you say in the documentary, coronavirus has reordered the competition for world power. And so not surprisingly, it reordered cyber power as well. Talk a little bit about that. And also, I'm interested in you talking about, which is something that is brought up several times in the documentary, about Russia's use of the Ukraine as a petri dish, because we saw that at the beginning of the coronavirus.
So Ukraine has been Russia's petri dish. It's where it tested out messing with elections, presidential elections. It's where it tested out turning off the power in electric utilities. It used all kinds of information warfare around the spread of COVID. But the real reordering has come from China's effort to go steal COVID research. Now, they're doing some very good COVID vaccine research of their own. But the Chinese recognize that whatever country really comes up with a vaccine first and can spread it around the rest of the world is going to have enormous soft power around the rest of the world. If the Chinese can be the first one to show up in NATO countries and say, those Americans, they're going to be sticking the vaccine into the arms of Americans first.
This is the Holy Grail.
This is it.
So what is fascinating about that is also 5G comes into this as well.
5G does, because this all happens at a moment when the Chinese are using the opportunity to go spread new networks throughout the world, the 5G, fifth generation networks, which is really a rewiring of the innards of the internet. And while 5G, we all think about it in terms of our phones, in fact, its real import is enabling you over cellular connections to operate factories, to operate autonomous vehicles. In other words, to work at speeds that right now you can only work at if you're someplace that's got internet service in the building. And they've recognized that if they can lay this cable around the world, if they can build the switches around the world, if they can do the software around the world's communications will flow through their networks the way they flowed through America's since Alexander Graham Bell's time.
You make the point that they are exploiting the chasms that are already present in the United States. How do you think, the obvious question, of course, as many of us have already gone to the polls, but for the people who are going to the polls, and even for votes that have already been cast, how safe are they?
I'm not that worried about the voting machines. I am worried about the registration system, because the registration systems are vulnerable. Just on Monday, the governor of Florida showed up to vote early.
Mm-hmm.
And what did he discover? That his address had been changed from Tallahassee to West Palm Beach. Now, the police just arrested a young hacker who was going in to do this either as a political statement or a prank. But if it was that easy to get into the registration system and change the governor's address for him, imagine how easy it would be for the Iranians or the North Koreans or even the Junior League hackers team in Russia.
So what impact could it have? Question one. Question two, and when do we become aware of it?
Numerically, I don't think it's going to have much impact. You mentioned before the concept of a perception hack.
Yes.
If you can get into the registration systems of just a few towns and cities in Wisconsin or Minnesota or Pennsylvania or Florida, you name the battleground state, you could create the impression that you're in the system throughout the state. Now, the president's already said this election will be rigged. He's been quite clear about that. He has said if he does not win, it's only because someone rigged it against him. So if his incentive in 2016 was to say there was no interference, I think he's probably a little bit predisposed now, just looking at his Twitter feed, to suggest that there may be interference. And this time next week, if it's a close election, you could well see him making that argument. If it's not a close election, then I think it's a much tougher argument to make.
And it could still happen, but it's a tougher argument.
That's right. And also, I don't think anybody was anticipating that we would have this much early voting and this much mail-in voting. And while I know the president says mail-in voting leads to fraud, it also creates a paper trail. So we can figure out, even if there is hacking, what the intent was of most voters.
Do you feel just having been a reporter for so long, do you sense, is there a sense of dread looking at next week thinking, oh God?
You know, Joe, you've been in this business for a long time. The citizen in me might say a bit of dread. The journalist in me says, we're going to learn a lot about how the system's evolved. And that's really why I wanted the Perfect Weapon documentary to come out before the election, so that we're all thinking about these hacks of the infrastructure and these hacks of the mind.
Final question for you for this part. Final question for you is there anything we can do about it?
There is, to some degree. You know, you have locks on your front doors and alarm systems and so forth, and that's to eliminate 85% of like the walk by, drive by crime in the neighborhood, right? And that's what basic cybersecurity is about. It's why you don't use the same password for everything. It's why you pay attention to what you're clicking on when you get that spear phishing email. But we also have to recognize that those locks on the doors do not protect you from an incoming missile. That we're leaving for the government. And the big question for cyber is, where is that line between our own responsibility or our companies or our employers' responsibility to protect us? Where does that end and the government begin? And we're just now really still struggling with that question as a nation.
The name of the book, the name of the documentary, The Perfect Weapon. David Sanger, a great pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for spending the time with us.
Great to be with you, Joe.
Thank you. Laura, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, both of you, David and Joe. And now we're going to do two things. We're going to take some questions in just a minute. But first, we're going to bring in Mary Brooks, who was an associate producer on the documentary, and talk a little bit about the documentary. But before we do that, David, could you just talk for a moment about what you're learning tonight?
What I'm learning tonight on those attacks.
On the attacks, yes.
Well, we're still trying to figure it out. Or we do know that the United States government and both the U.S. government and the Microsoft and a number of other companies went after the structure of ransomware attacks. It's code called TrickBot, and we've been reporting on this for a few weeks, where they went to go take down servers all around the world that were being used to launch ransomware attacks on American companies, on cities in Florida and little towns in Texas. You've been reading about these for more than a year. And the reason that they did this was that they did not want that infrastructure to be there in the middle of the election, in case cities and towns across America got ransomware attacks that basically were there to lock up the election systems or lock up the registration systems. So that when you, Laura, went to go vote here in Vermont or in New York, somebody might say, well, we don't see you registered, you know, or we can't get into our registration databases. Now we're seeing attacks on hospitals.
Yeah.
And the big question is this in retaliation for the decision to go take down the rest of this infrastructure? And we're still reporting that out. Sometimes it's very hard to tell. We may never know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll keep checking the New York Times tonight and tomorrow. So I want to bring in Mary to tell us. So Mary, how did you first meet David?
Hi, Laura. Thanks for having me. And David and Joe, it was wonderful to hear your discussion for the last hour. Yeah, so I was a student. I was an undergraduate at Harvard studying government and Arabic. And I think my area of focus could generally be considered the Middle East. And I happened to walk into a class that David teaches there at the Kennedy School. It's co-taught with the former dean of the Kennedy School, Graham Allison, and Professor Derek Reverin. And it's tremendous class on, honestly, the title is a bit long, and David, you might have to refresh my memory on the full name, but it's The Central Challenges of American Foreign Policy. And it really digs into not only strategy, but also the players that the government has to contend with and cannot control. And in this case, the significant one is the media.
So how then did David rope you into both being a researcher on his book and then associate producer on the documentary? And I know our students are going to be particularly interested in, what it was like working on the documentary.
It was amazing. Just to kind of start with the documentary, it was a process very much unlike anything I'd expected going in. My background prior to that was very much research, working for a law firm, and to get thrown into the middle of a very small production team, working at a quick pace to get this out in under a year was wild. I mean, in any given day, I was trying to help book interviews, running pre-interviews, reaching out to people that were well known in the environment and people who were, maybe I found them through their LinkedIn profiles, like for example, the Sands employees. There was a lot of quick collaboration, thinking on your feet, and being a lot scrappier than I ever thought I would have to be in college. I think I had this idea that the professional world ran so smoothly, and being in the middle of production really reminded me that no, it's just who can think on their feet, who can kind of go forward the most quickly. As for how I started working for David, he asked. He just said, "Hey, I'm working on this book. We're looking for someone to tackle the China section. Do you want to study China and technology?" And like I said, I was studying the Middle East. It really seems like something far out of my own sphere. But I had this policy at the time, and I try to hold to it now, which is when you see an opportunity, take it, because you never know where it will lead, what you'll get out of it, or whether the same type of opportunity will ever come up again. And so that kind of sent me on this three-year now journey into working with David and working on cyber conflict policy.
That's great. So one of the challenges is to take a book that is so dense with information and make it a really compelling and a compelling documentary, one that holds one's attention so much. So can you both talk about how you approached kind of making this documentary so vivid and also visual? And I want to ask people, if you have a question for David while they're answering this question, just put it in the Q&A, and then we'll open it up for questions, and I'll moderate those questions. So David, why don't you first, how did you approach this, the documentary, and how did you think about the visual and the kind of how to boil down what is an incredible book of lots of information into a documentary on video?
Well, first of all, Mary and I were very lucky to be working with a really incredible director, John Maggio, who runs something called Art Media, but has done a lot of HBO documentaries before. And Mary and I met with John here in Vermont in the summer of 2019, as he had just read the book and was just beginning to think about how you do exactly what you suggest, the challenge of making this interesting. And his first insight was, let's focus on the victims, because that will put a human face on these hacks. And as I said before, he was not going to sit there and show a bunch of people typing on keyboards with, numbers running above and below that you couldn't read. And it was really interesting, because his first instinct was to go talk to a set of victims. And my first reporter's instinct wasn't that. It was to go figure out who was doing the hacking and so forth. And he was right. And, I said to Mary early on, this is going to be very unlike the experience of working on the book. It's the same material, but you have to think about it in a completely different way. And Laurie, you and I talked about this some when you were running WNYC. I think the most important thing that I tell students now, particularly journalism students or anybody thinking about this, is the days are over when you can simply think about being a reporter and writing a news story. You've got to be able to do this in written form. You've got to be able to do it for radio. You've got to be able to do it for podcasts. And you have to begin to think visually about how you're going to do it in some visual form. And so I said to Mary, look, you were crazy enough to sign up to go do the book. So if you want to do something really crazy, why don't you go see if you can turn this into a documentary? So she moved to New York to work with John on just that. And it was quite a wild ride.
Molly, would love your perspective on that. And then also, before we take questions, I wonder if you have, you gave one piece of advice to students, which is really, to take an opportunity if you see it. But if you have any other advice for students who might be interested in documentary films or researching or writing about cybersecurity or international events.
Yeah, of course. So I think that David gave a really good high level kind of the way that he, as the executive producer and author, and John, the director, who's incredibly creative, were conceptualizing this film was a little bit different, of just simply based on their decision-making power. Our crew had, a number of producers above me, and then I was the associate producer. So a lot of my work was executing, and I really found it to be a form of translation. I had studied Spanish and Arabic in school. I'm familiar with translating languages, but less between topics. And I think that has really, the experience really taught me that there is a gap in the US between people that understand the technology and people who understand the policy. And to be able to bridge that gap, even on something like a documentary, it's not easy, but it's something that's so critical. And I can give, an example, which is I came in, with this background knowledge about cyber and, who the big players in the world were and what the big events were. And I joined a team that was really, really good at making documentaries, but who really couldn't tell me the first thing about cyber conflict. And I couldn't tell them the first thing about, a camera. So there was a lot of easing it out in those first days, a lot of kind of picking the pieces together, admitting where I just really didn't know things. And they would do the same to me. There was a lot of humility on the team. And so we were translating almost within the team, translating between potential interviewees. So like I said, one of my key jobs was to reach out to people. Sometimes they were high level in the national security community. And sometimes they were people who had never talked to the media before. And it was just going back and forth to see if you could convey to the potential interviewee, are you someone we can talk to? Are you someone we can put on the screen? Because can you explain this policy, explain this consideration to our broader audience? Mm-hmm. And so I was thinking a lot more in the kind of the nitty gritty day-to-day type of really what I would call translation work. And there were definitely times where I was taken aback, being told to reach out to Seth Rogen's team for someone that, envisioned myself in the moment as someone who really dove into the policy side of things was a shock, but it was one of the greatest moves I think that John did. As for advice, I'm only a few years out of college myself, but I would just say that the things that have served me the best over the past couple years, one is just simply being reliable. I was always taught to double check. I graduated and I quickly learned that double checking is not enough. You can't rely on someone who only double checks. So especially at the lower levels of a team, intern, associate producer, research assistant, like the buck does stop with you. You think that, someone will catch it. If I miss it, they won't. Like it's you. And when I worked at the law firm, the interns that I could give interesting work to were the people who had proven that they were going to check it 5, 6, 10 times. And as absurd as that sounds, I watched that documentary probably 100, 500 times. I could quote it for you. And then the other thing is just to be proactive, to point out issues before they become issues, to say, hey, this part seems like it might be defamatory. This part of the book looks like someone might have accidentally plagiarized a portion of it. This part of the script seems to not actually be accurate. Are we sure that this is what the interviewee was saying? And just catching those things in advance, even if you don't know what's wrong, just saying something is wrong here. It's beyond what I know, and I'm elevating it to make sure that it gets caught. Because I think in this industry, you live and die on your facts.
Excellent. That is so great. And I also want to thank you, David, for your offer to talk to the students who have just started a newspaper here at Bennington. So you will hear advice like
I'm going to regret that, Laura.
I may, right?
I mean, when I worked on a student newspaper, the first one we focused on was the president of the college.
Of course, part of the deal. But let me go to questions from a student. David, how do you see deep fake technology affecting future political events, and or how would it affect cybersecurity?
It's a great question. So, we thought this might be the election of deep fakes because the technology is so good now that you could reproduce somebody's voice. I heard a tape the other day that somebody did of Barack Obama giving a speech that sounded exactly like Obama, but the words clearly, when you listen to the content, were nothing Barack Obama would ever say. It was pretty spooky. There are websites you can go to that basically show you photos of people who do not exist. And so the amount of damage you can go do with that in the political sphere, but not just in the political sphere, would be pretty high. So far, we haven't seen that yet in this cycle. We've seen other things. But over time, that's going to be a big issue because, the old saying, who are you going to believe, you or your lying eyes, right? And it may turn out that what you see is not really what happened. And it's a scary technology because it's gotten so cheap and so accurate and so believable.
Yeah. Thank you. This question from a faculty member, the cyber warfare threats in the documentary focus on foreign nation states. Are there substantial threats that are internal or domestic from anti-government groups or others who would like to disrupt American democracy from within?
Absolutely. And the oddity is the distinction between foreign and domestic is really falling away. We have seen cases in the past few years where a news story starts abroad and is repeated in some form of American media, usually fringe media. The theory being that if you can get it into the fringe media and people repeating it on Facebook enough, then it will become part of the mainstream discussion. And then sooner or later, it makes it into credible media. So it's a step function through. And once that happens, it gets bounced back into foreign media. I'll give you an example. In the 2016 cycle, we saw the workers at the Internet Research Agency coming up with invented people and invented protests. At one point, they tried to organize a Black Lives Matter protest, I think in Texas, and then an anti-protest on the same day across the street so that they would create a real life domestic problem. And people on both sides didn't realize they were being manipulated by the Internet Research Agency. This cycle, we've seen much less of that, partly because Facebook's now looking for the Internet Research Agency and Twitter's looking for it. But what we have seen them do is take statements that were made by, for example, President Trump about the mail-in ballots and how they lead to fraud. And they pick up on the theme and start writing stories that run on foreign media about the fraud risks of mail-in ballots, which then bounce back here and feed the argument inside the United States. So while I think it's a fascinating question, I think this year we've sort of determined that the distinction between foreign and domestic is really eroding fast.
Yeah. So this question from a student, I'm wondering if an expanding network of 5G owned by a country, say China or the US or any other country, might enable said country to establish frameworks for accessing natural resources and digital infrastructures within countries that are using their network. If so, is this happening or has it? What are current examples or predictions of this? And do you think it's a concern?
It's a big concern. It's a superb question. So China is not simply trying to expand its business by offering 5G networks in the developing world, or to some members of NATO who might not want to pay the money to build a more expensive Western-built 5G network. And instead what they're doing is they're coming in and saying, here's a network we can build for you. And we'll give you low interest or zero interest loans to go do it. And for the more autocratic countries that are making the offer, they're saying, and I'll tell you what, we will throw in the facial recognition systems that we're using in Hong Kong, so that if you have any dissenters out on the streets, you can go pick them out and pick them up, right? And so you can imagine to a Viktor Orban, for example, or any other authoritarian, they're buying more than just a modern communication system. They're buying a system of control. Then once those networks are built, they're going to be routed through Chinese software, probably through Beijing. So there's an opportunity to pick up the traffic. But more importantly, if there was a conflict between the West and China, something many believe and worry about could happen in the future, we're suddenly dependent on a communication system, or our allies are, that the Chinese could turn off. And the great example here was Italy last year, which appeared to be signing up for the Chinese, the Huawei 5G system, till the US and some other NATO allies went and said, well, how can we share data with you as a NATO ally if we think it's routing through Beijing? The Italians are slowly rethinking this, but many other countries are signing right up.
Yeah. And are there examples that you can think of, or worries that you have about natural resources or other kinds of infrastructure being, attacked? And
well, if you own the network, it's a lot easier to go arrange the attack on the system. We haven't seen that happen yet, but you're creating a level of dependency because you're building a oil refinery that's going to run on 5G, right? Which means basically the factory itself is being built around the network, and the network is controlled by a foreign entity. Now, that may not be terrible, but you may want that foreign entity to at least be part of your alliance or circle. And that's what we're grappling with for the first time here, because in the Cold War, there was a Western world and there was a Soviet-dominated world, but there wasn't much but either economic or technological interdependency. That's what makes what's going on between the United States and China right now, and the West China, so much more complicated and so much more fascinating than the Cold War. People say, oh, we're heading into Cold War II. No. We're heading into something that is infinitely more complicated than the Cold War ever was, because we were never dependent on Soviet-built systems.
Yeah. So I'm going to paraphrase a few questions and maybe, or summarize a few questions, and maybe Mary and David, you can answer the question. I think there are a number of questions about, okay, so on one hand, one of the messages of the documentary and your book is we need to be more vigilant. And are we being as aggressive in both defending ourselves as a country and in being proactive? And on the other hand, you don't seem to be as worried about the elections as some people had expected. And can you talk a little bit about maybe what we should be doing that we're not doing, and whether the kind of sense around the elections that maybe we don't have to worry so much about it being tampered with should set us at ease a little?
It's a question of what part of the system you're worried about. So I've never been that worried about the voting machines. They're offline, and every state does these things differently. And because every state does them differently, attacking the voting machines at scale would be very difficult. You might get away with it in Europe, where some countries use one system throughout the entire country, but every state is different. We vote differently in Vermont than we vote next door in New Hampshire. The registration systems, as I mentioned, that's a vulnerability because they are outward facing. You can sit at your desk at home and sign up to register, which means somebody can go in and pretend that you're the governor of Florida. If you think about that distinction between hacking infrastructure and hacking minds, it's the minds that are becoming the bigger issue in this election. That we have seen both foreign and domestic efforts to basically repeat falsehoods on a large scale. There is no statistical evidence that mail-in ballots are any more subject to fraud than anything else we've done. We've got 5 states in the country that have been doing all mail-in ballots for years. So we've got a good base to do this on. But the big question is, next week, if things are close, are we going to see small events blown up as to bigger ones? That there was a problem in one precinct in Wisconsin, so the entire state must be suspect. And frankly, as journalists, I think one of our biggest responsibilities next week is not to get ahead of ourselves when we see incidents.
Yeah. Mary, what's your perspective on that?
I was going to say there's a great piece on Axios today. Axios has a wonderful cyber newsletter if anyone is interested in subscribing, and it's free, and it's, I believe, daily or weekly. And they basically made the argument that David's making now, which is simply, you know, some of this could end up, some of the fear around elections, some of the lack of faith in the integrity of the elections could prove just as damaging as any hack against the infrastructure, the registration systems, or the voting machines themselves. And so I think that to me is the much broader concern, especially given, you know, I'm from the West. I've spent a lot of time in the Midwest. People are already disengaged. Young people are already not voting. People already think that their vote doesn't matter. People already don't like the candidates. And so they don't really need another reason to not vote. And so I think what that does is that tells you that cyber is not to be viewed in a silo. Our security is a lot broader than our technical security. And it's not just with elections that this is the kind of thing that we need to be worried about. We need to be thinking about how to integrate all of these systems together if we're going to be effective in the long term in terms of the national defense. Very briefly, with cyber deterrence, and our ability to prevent attacks against the US before they happen. I mean, that's something, of course, that David can speak to a lot more than me, but it's something that even the experts are struggling to determine whether or not traditional deterrence will work with something as opaque and secretive and deniable as a cyber. But if you're interested in kind of the longer term view of how the US is looking to defend itself, the Cyber Solarium Commission, which was a high level group of experts that gathered over the last year, they put out a report talking about just that. You know, how do we kind of layer on security and defense and stop this increasingly damaging pattern of attacks?
So you both mentioned the media and coverage. We have a question from a student about the coverage of the 2020 elections, and should the media be transparently covering foreign intervention, and how do you, as you started to say, David, how do you, the media also has a job not to sensationalize this news and to get to the bottom of it and to protect citizens from being stirred by kind of a perception hack undermining election legitimacy. Can you just talk about how you think about that as a journalist, David, and what you think the media's responsibility is?
Well, we've got big teams at the New York Times, but not just at the Times, who are focusing on this now. In 2016, we didn't. There was a pretty small group of us who were covering the hacking. It actually took a while to convince the news organizations, not just the Times, but others as well, that the Russians actually were in the system and that this was a big news story at the time. I think there is a risk in 2020 of going the other direction. You know, having had too many of our radars off in 2016, that we may see Russian interference in lots of other places. So Laura, when we were all having dinner earlier today, you saw me rudely get up and go take some phone calls. And it was as we were trying to judge how severe these potential attacks on the hospitals were. And we don't know yet. And so I think one of the most important things that we're going to see in the next week or two is, having the willingness to pull back and make sure something is truly significant before you make a big deal of it.
Yeah.
And, we're going to make mistakes along the way. Things that we will judge as small may turn out to be bigger. Things that may seem at first to loom large may turn out to be relatively insignificant. But the trick is to assemble a team of people who come at the expertise quite differently. And, that was one of the great things that Mary brought to our project, which is, you may have noticed, we're of a different generation. I realize it doesn't look that way, but it's true. And the result is that, she was seeing things that seemed important on social media and in the conversation that wouldn't necessarily resonate with me. And she also served a very essential role within the documentary team because she understood the book and the questions like the deterrence theory that we deal with in the book, but frankly is really hard to go do. It's more for a Bennington seminar than it is for a documentary. And so the trick is, how can you cover these issues and write about them without making people think, on the one hand, you're sensationalizing, and on the other hand, that you're conducting a foreign policy seminar for them on deterrence.
Yeah, and you have a team, and you have probably the deepest knowledge of any reporter in the world about cybersecurity. There's a challenge for other reporters and for small shops to report and to understand this. And Mary, I'd love to hear your thoughts, as you're obviously following social media and looking at others who are covering cybersecurity. How do reporters, get educated, and what more can we do to make sure that there's coverage in all sorts of places?
I think personally, as I got more involved in the subject matter, the more I realized that a lot of the coverage was, I don't want to say imperfect, because I think by nature, perfection is an impossible standard, but there was a lot of either inaccuracies or echo chamber going on. And in particular with 5G, because that's where David and I did some research in particular together. And it was surprising to see how many people just repeated what was going on in other places without kind of digging in for themselves. And I think the push to get information out, especially when you're younger, when you're less proven, is so high. If you have got your name to fall back on, if you establish a record for 30, 40 years of doing this, you might be able to kind of bite your tongue and wait. But think about, do you remember the Shadow app with the Iowa caucus?
Yes.
Right. So suddenly, we had one of our producers over in Iowa, or maybe near Iowa, and she was getting this note from a friend that there was this Shadow app, and maybe Robbie Mook had something to do with it, and she didn't go anywhere with it, but a bunch of other people online did, and suddenly it started spiraling out of control. And Robbie Mook, who was the Clinton campaign, and he was starting to say, no, this wasn't me. Like it wasn't, but it was too late. The narrative was gone. Suddenly Clinton was back in the election, and I think it's a tremendous challenge, and it just falls back on, just because someone else writes something, you don't get to stand on that person's shoulders until you dig it down for yourself, or you find enough supporting evidence. And we frankly, I have tremendous respect for the media and for journalism as an industry, but that is, I think, a key weakness of the current iteration.
Okay. So we have time for one last question. So all of you whose questions we didn't get to, thank you very much for asking them. But I'm going to leave you with a pretty large question from a Bennington alum who writes, as a Bennington student and then a graduate student at NYU in political economics a number of years ago, it seems that the notion of geopolitical players has completely been transformed by technology. How do you foresee our defining political economic players as nations, businesses, and citizens? That's a pretty large question to
It is. And it's just the right question, Laura, because I found, as I was speaking about the book around the country, and then the documentary in recent weeks, that people understand that they're getting hacked every day. They're getting these letters that say the Chinese have your credit card numbers, or somebody has gone in and gotten your social security numbers and those of your kids and so forth. And then they read about these state actors who are using cyber to improve their national power, but they don't put the two together very much. And particularly, I find this when I talk to companies where they all know they're being hacked every day, but they don't know why. And I think that your alum is getting it right at just the right issue. This is a political tool now, in addition to being a tool by which people commit crimes and raise money, by which people communicate, by which people spread information. And it's as important a political tool and as important a weapon for daily conflict, and maybe in the future for warfare, as the invention of the airplane was. We invented the airplane to move people around the world more quickly. We invented the internet to move information around the world more quickly. And what did we do with the airplane? We figured out how to arm it and put nuclear weapons underneath it. And in World War II, it was used to drop an atomic bomb. That was not what Orville and Wilbur had in mind initially, but it was used for the most ultimate geopolitical purpose, to win a war that was really a struggle of civilizations. And the same is true in cyber. It's just that right now we're kind of stuck at that end of World War I period, where cyber's been used in a few skirmishes back and forth, but it hasn't really become a strategic weapon yet. I suspect in the next decade or so, it will. I mean, the fact that it's already being used to influence elections tells you what a critical geopolitical tool it is. And so we've all got to think of it as another tool of geopolitics. And it's not a separate thing where there's kind of cyber warfare and there's the rest of the struggle among nations that's gone on for as long as history. It is all one. It's being integrated into one. It's just the way nations will be competing now and in the future.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I actually can't resist asking you this final question from one of the members of our Bennington community. What is the best Seth Rogen movie? Mary, do you have one?
I don't have one, but I'm sure Mary does.
Sorry.
I feel so guilty.
American Pickle.
I've never heard of it.
Okay, sorry. Thank you
I
so
have to
much.
say though that the interview with Seth Rogen, if you're not interested in cyber, you're welcome to move right ahead to Seth Rogen describing what it was like to go be in this crazy movie about the assassination of Kim Jong-un. Discover that you're part of an international incident and the president is talking about you from the press room. So.
I mean, without Seth Rogen, I don't think any of my friends would have watched the film. Know your audience.
So keep me posted on what you think the best movie is. So anyway, thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, Mary. This has been such an enlightening conversation. And we are particularly grateful, David, for you to take time out just a week before the election as you're reporting, and we're reporting during dinner, and really appreciate it. And Joe, that was a great interview. And if anyone wants to hear it again, tune in on Friday at 11. Is that right?
Friday at 11.
Friday at 11 on any of the 23 stations of WAMC. Thank you so much.